few nights ago, I was talking to a digital illustrator I know. He's based in Florence. And he was showing me his latest project, a reimagining of classical Renaissance masterpieces using generative AI. He was leaning into his monitor with just this genuine excitement, typing a prompt to recreate Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. He expected this stunning high-resolution tribute to one of history's greatest works of art. But instead of a masterpiece, the screen just went blank. A cold clinical dialogue box popped up. This prompt has been blocked. It violates our safety guidelines regarding nudity. He just sat back, looking completely baffled. He wasn't trying to create something scandalous. He was trying to engage with his own cultural heritage. But the AI, designed and programmed thousands of miles away in a Silicon Valley office park, it didn't see heritage. It saw a violation. In that one moment, a group of engineers in California had effectively decided what a man in Italy was allowed to define as art. It's a strange, quiet kind of power. We used to think of cultural imperialism as, Hollywood movies or rock stars on world tours, exports you could choose to watch or turn off. But today, the influence is so much deeper. It's woven into the very fabric of the internet itself. It's baked into the code of the apps we use, the filters on our cameras, and the algorithms that decide which parts of the world are appropriate and which are, too extreme. We've built this global digital square, but the rules of engagement are being written by a single neighborhood in America. That instantaneous shift from a tool of infinite creativity to a rigid enforcer of suburban American morality, it raises a haunting question. In our hyper-connected world, are we actually sharing cultures, or are we all just living in one giant digital version of the United States?
That Florentine anecdote is. It's more than just a funny story about an overcautious algorithm. It is the perfect illustration of what we're talking about today. Algorithmic governance. It really defines this profound, very quiet shift in global power dynamics. And it proves that the very infrastructure of our modern digital world, well, it's not neutral, not at all. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the hard evidence. We need to show how American digital infrastructure and the specific ideological and cultural biases baked right into it is being exported globally. It's acting as a new and incredibly pervasive form of cultural and political control. This influence, you see, it doesn't arrive via military conquest or some big trade dispute. It arrives through mandatory software updates and lines of code.
It sets a pretty chilling stage. The idea that the rules of engagement are now entirely defined by the parameters of code and data sets, not by international treaties or local customs.
Absolutely. And the material we've gathered for this, it helps us trace the systemic effect of this digital hegemony. Some are calling it the American devolution, this revolution of private technological interests gaining just massive public and political power. We're going to explore three key interwoven areas that really illustrate this unprecedented structure of control. First, we'll examine the specific mechanisms, the algorithms, and the AI that are used to export American social norms. And crucially, how this action dissolves organic cultural hierarchies all over the world. Second, we'll look at the huge global institutional and political impact this is having. This includes the collapse of, common sense norms, profound institutional distrust, and the rise of this radical political dissatisfaction that drives populism. We can call it the spirit of negation. And finally, we'll dive deep into the core philosophy of Silicon Valley, what we can call the venture capital cultural complex, because that's the ideological and financial engine that's generating and legitimating this whole new structure of quiet power.
Okay, let's start right where we began then, with the tools themselves. When that illustrator's prompt was blocked, he ran straight into the problem of generative bias. He was using this powerful, highly complex generative AI model, yet its output was rigidly filtered by a very specific, very local cultural perspective that saw a Renaissance nude as a safety violation.
And this is the fundamental threat. It's a threat to global cultural standards and even to meritocracy. You have to remember, when we talk about powerful digital tools, whether it's ChatGPT for text or Midjourney for images, they are trained on these vast data sets, and they're guarded by sophisticated safety filters. These filters, they inevitably reflect the current political, social, and cultural values that are dominant in their development locations.
Which in this case means Silicon Valley.
Exactly, and it's prevailing progressive identity politics.
So the tool isn't merely reflecting information back at us. It's actively applying an ideological mandate.
It is institutionalizing a specific set of assumptions right within the digital infrastructure. Critics argue this is a therapeutic state framework.
A therapeutic state framework. What do you mean by that?
It's a framework that prioritizes emotional and psychological safety above all else. above traditional values like, say, artistic freedom, cultural context, or historical reverence. It treats any deviation from a narrow, prescribed set of norms as a source of potential harm.
And that harm has to be mitigated.
But by force of code, exactly.
So instead of being this neutral engine that reflects global input, the tool acts as a moral gatekeeper. It's imposing a specific ideological lens onto the entire global culture. It's not just that the AI has biases, it's that these biases are now the foundation upon which global digital interactions and creations have to occur.
And that process results in what the philosopher Jacques Ellul called technical universalism. It's the tendency for technological solutions and their underlying logic to spread, geographically and culturally. And in doing so, they displace local organic practices. The Italian illustrator's experience is textbook. The AI cannot recognize a cultural hierarchy where a Botticelli masterpiece holds specific historical and artistic value. All it can do is apply a universal, generalized standard of decency or safety that's derived from a contemporary American context.
So the unique, centuries-old local context is just rendered invisible. It becomes irrelevant to the universal filter.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's the dissolution of organic cultural hierarchies in real time.
Yeah, if you think about the enormous cultural diversity that exists across Asia, Africa, or Europe, so much of it involves imagery or narratives or social structures that might violate a contemporary Western framework of what's appropriate conduct or content.
Absolutely. Think about an artisan in Kyoto. Maybe they're trying to use AI to restore or modernize traditional woodblock prints. Those prints might contain subtle, historically specific depictions of sexuality or power dynamics. The foundational AI might just flag it, based on contemporary sensitivities around consent or gender representation.
And in doing so, it completely erases the local organic meaning.
In favor of a general, sanitized, global standard.
It's like importing a single specific set of suburban zoning laws from the American Midwest and applying them uniformly to every historical city in the world, from Rome to Mumbai.
All local complexity is flattened.
And the power structure is so much deeper than the traditional model of cultural imperialism. Hollywood exports, you could just ignore them. This is pervasive.
This is the critical difference. Traditional cultural exports were consumer choices. You could turn them off. This new influence is woven into the internet's fundamental fabric. It's in the code, the content filters, and the underlying assumptions of what constitutes appropriate communication or creation. This silent imposition dictates what is too extreme, what is acceptable, and what is technologically possible on a global scale.
And it specifically targets the collapse of those mediating institutions, right? The ones that held local cultural norms in place.
Precisely. This is the conquest of cultural spectacle, and it uses technological acceleration as its historical drive. Ellul argued that this acceleration, this relentless expansion of technical systems, has to be understood not as a neutral process, but as an autonomous, self-augmenting colonization. The sheer capacity to scale these systems globally, rapidly, and without any local input, that is the very mechanism of cultural power.
It replaces local law with administrative decree.
And local self-governance with an unlimited algorithmic state.
It seems like a fundamental contradiction, though. These tools are marketed as being about decentralized power and infinite creation, yet they fundamentally enforce conformity to an incredibly narrow, localized American worldview. It's a closed system masquerading as a global utility. And if this algorithm can censor a Renaissance painting, what is it quietly shaping about the political content you see in your feed every morning, or even the music recommendations you get? That's the part that hits closest to home for the average user, I think.
And that invisible, unaccountable algorithmic power structure we just discussed, it's not operating in a vacuum. It is mirrored and in many ways enabled by a specific kind of political structure that has dominated Western democracies for decades. We call it the managerial state.
The managerial state. What's the defining characteristic of that? Because it sounds like it exists beyond the normal cycle of electoral politics.
That's the core of the critique. Political theorists use that term to describe an ongoing regime of procedural democracy, a permanent consensus of unelected administrators, bureaucrats, university heads, and, senior journalists. People who maintain power regardless of which political party holds the majority.
So it's the deep administrative function, the sprawling bureaucracy, and the institutional continuity of the elite class that defines the system.
Exactly. And we see several overlapping terms used to describe this institutional leviathan, depending on which aspect of its overreach is being criticized.
Right, I've heard a few of these.
It's frequently called the therapeutic managerial state because it seeks to intervene to to enforce psychological and social well-being.
Often through things like behavioral modification and language policing.
Precisely. It's also the welfare warfare state because of its dual mandate of running vast social programs at home while projecting military power globally.
And the administrative state.
Because its power rests overwhelmingly in unaccountable rulemaking by federal agencies, bypassing democratic processes. And sometimes, because of the pressure on citizens to conform to ideological mandates, it's even termed soft totalitarianism or polite totalitarianism.
That's a serious claim, that this structure acts as a self-sustaining entity. So what ultimately is the core logic keeping this vast, self-perpetuating system afloat if elected officials don't seem to make a fundamental difference in its direction?
The core logic is a claim to moral superiority and procedural sanctity. And it's all underpinned by these abstract goals.
Things like freedom, equality, social justice.
Exactly. Theorists argue this regime acts in the name of those elevated goals, and it uses its power of taxation and wealth redistribution to keep itself fundamentally in power. And when it lacks democratic support for its actual policies, which is often, it resorts to sanctimony and social engineering.
Which is delivered how?
Via mandatory programs, judicial decisions, and dense regulations. Unlike a company, a bureaucracy of this nature accumulates failure, but it never, ever goes out of business.
Its power is derived from its ability to claim moral and technical authority, while simultaneously obscuring the details of its failures.
And this dynamic, it creates the perfect conditions for the profound global dissatisfaction we've seen erupt everywhere.
The revolt of the public.
Yes. When the public looks at this seemingly permanent, unaccountable elite, they see institutions that are, as some have observed, cash cows for the haves, an oppressive machinery for bleeding the have-nots.
The statistics on trust are just. They're absolutely staggering.
They are. Public trust in government was at 70 to 80% during the administrations of Kennedy and Johnson.
This was pre-Vietnam, pre-Watergate.
Right, and those events were inflection points, but the decline has been steady and accelerating ever since. By the end of Obama's second term, that trust had plummeted to just 19%.
19%. That represents a catastrophic, systemic loss of legitimacy.
The public isn't just frustrated anymore. They are fundamentally disillusioned with institutions that claim to provide settled truth and fair governance.
And that disillusionment fuels a very specific, very powerful type of political action, the revolt of negation.
The public might have a vague, often contradictory notion of what is for, but it knows with absolute terrible clarity what it stands against.
The managerial class.
Yes. This spirit of negation is the fuel for mass uprisings, whether it's the yellow vests in France railing against those paracentric environmental mandates and cost of living increases, or various movements focused on systemic racial or economic inequality. And crucially, it fuels the election of unorthodox populists.
People like Donald Trump or Javier Milei in Argentina.
Exactly. These populists often lack a detailed, positive program for governance. Their energy is concentrated almost entirely on nihilistic rhetoric and negation. They just rail against the system they detest.
Right. Milei used a motosierra, a chainsaw, as his literal political symbol.
To represent his intent to violently hack away at the bloated, intrusive Argentine administrative state. The symbol itself was the platform.
And that power of negation is now gaining legitimacy, thanks in part to the normalization of Trump's movement. The defenses of the old regime, the cordon sanitaire, they've completely collapsed.
The cordon sanitaire is a critical concept here. It's a political strategy. It literally means quarantine line. It's used by establishment parties to isolate and demonize anti-establishment figures, like what they applied to Marine Le Pen in France or the Alternative for Germany party.
They label them as extremists, moral outcasts, fascists.
Effectively disenfranchising their millions of voters and preventing them from gaining mainstream legitimacy. But with the second coming of Trump, that whole defense just crumbled. We saw accomplished, previously non-political personalities like Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Tulsi Gabbard endorse him unashamedly.
And then, after his election, you saw that procession of figures making the pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago, Joe Scarborough, Mark Zuckerberg. It wasn't just political opportunism. It symbolized the complete collapse of the old political defenses. It was an acceptance that the negationist movement is now a permanent political force.
And the implication for the establishment is, frankly, terrifying. Once it becomes politically unacceptable to demonize populism, democratic politics reverts back to a competition over actual issues.
And that's the true crisis for them.
It is, particularly for those whose elite political obsessions, abstract concepts of equity, costly energy transitions, open immigration, are often at best irrelevant to the public's pressing economic and safety concerns.
And at worst, they're highly unpopular electoral issues.
Right. These pet projects can only be imposed from above as moral imperatives. They can't be won electorally on the ground. The normalization of negation forces elites to compete on reality-based ground, something they're structurally ill-prepared to do.
This atmosphere where you have this dysfunctional ideological elite focusing so intensely on abstract social goals while simultaneously neglecting core responsibilities, it leads us to a pretty frightening concept. Anarcho-tyranny, the idea that ordinary citizens end up on the receiving end of both chaos and focused state persecution.
This term was popularized by Samuel Francis. He used it to describe a paradoxical state. On one hand, violent crime and anarchy are constant. Laws that are supposed to protect ordinary citizens against criminals like prohibitions on retail theft, violent assault, or basic public disorder, they routinely go unenforced.
Even though the state is perfectly capable of enforcement.
Exactly. That's the anarchy part. Meanwhile, government elites concentrate intensely on regulating, surveying, and often persecuting law-abiding citizens over compliance with ever-shifting ideological rules.
And that's the tyranny part.
So on one hand, you might see police resources being used to investigate online speech or political dissent.
While on the other, you hear about smash-and-grab crime becoming an accepted part of life in major cities. It's this feeling of total neglect on issues that matter to your safety and livelihood, combined with intense ideological scrutiny on your private life.
Exactly. It's law without order, as one theorist put it. It's a constant busybodying about behavior that does not derive from a shared moral consensus. And it results in a public that feels the system is fundamentally hostile to them on two fronts at the same time.
Neglecting their physical safety while simultaneously regulating their internal thoughts and compliance.
This, more than anything else, explains why nihilistic rhetoric and opposition to the entire structure gains such traction. The system appears fundamentally rigged against the average, law-abiding citizen.
So the managerial state and the revolt against it provide the broad political context for all this instability. But to understand the digital governance we opened with, that code that censors a Botticelli, we have to turn now to the specific ideology driving the technical hegemony. We need to look at the venture capital complex, or VC complex, not just as a financial engine, but as a vanguard of cultural and political production.
This is a crucial shift in perspective. VC firms aren't just investors. They are, in many ways, the ideological architects of the modern world. They're often called the patron saint of Silicon Valley because their entire approach is grounded in evolutionary economics. Specifically, in Joseph Schumpeter's terrifyingly influential concept of creative destruction.
We hear that phrase creative destruction a lot. But what did Schumpeter specifically mean in a way that applies to modern VC?
Schumpeter argued that true vital competition isn't about shaving marginal profits or, optimizing existing products. He said it's competition that strikes not at the margins of the profits and the outputs of the existing firms, but at their foundations and their very lives.
So VC embraces this as a moral necessity.
Absolutely. The goal is to fundamentally destroy the foundations of existing economic and cultural forms through radical innovation. This philosophy elevates the capitalist entrepreneur not as a careful manager, but as the romantic, disruptive hero.
The lonely outsider who mounts a surprise attack against the established order.
Regardless of the social disruption it causes.
And this high-risk disruption model is integral to their survival, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's structurally necessary for their whole business model. I've heard it described using the whaling analogy.
That analogy, which business historian Tom Nicholas noted, is very telling. He pointed out that VC investment mirrors historical whaling ventures. Both are defined as highly lucrative but low probability payoff businesses.
Right. Historically, whaling required agents to coordinate massive investments, knowing that almost all the expeditions would fail or sink or come back empty.
Exactly. But a very, very tiny subset of those ventures would return with massive surfeits of oil. And that would make up for all the losses and provide enormous wealth.
This is the long-tail distribution of profit.
It is. For VC, extreme returns, that 1000x unicorn from a tiny subset of investments, becomes the normative rule of operation, not the exception. This structure of feeling extreme, asymmetrical risk for extreme, asymmetrical gain defines the entire culture of Silicon Valley.
And that structure of extreme risk defines a cultural mode, the speculative carnivalesque, where financial risk-taking and radically anti-establishment politics fuse into a cultural spectacle.
This is perhaps best seen in the Hereticon Festival, which was hosted by a key VC firm, Founders Fund. The event was billed as an end-of-the-world's fair and an apocalypse ball.
So it functions as a liminal space.
Yes, that's right. It's a long, large, expensive party in which normal social rules and hierarchies are temporarily suspended. It's a space for performing and testing political and cultural speculations. It's essentially a revel in the widespread condition of perceived social disaster, conceptualizing the future as a useful, profitable catastrophe.
And the centerpiece of this event was the open practice and celebration of thought crime. That's taking the term directly from George Orwell's 1984, right?
Absolutely. The term is used here to label positions that get people in trouble today. Positions considered highly transgressive or socially toxic.
But which are seen by these speculators as potentially undervalued ideas of the future.
The core logic is financial. If you are looking for cultural or political ideas that will gain extreme currency as the old order collapses, you should focus on ideas that get people in trouble.
So they're essentially prospecting the stochastic mysteries of the collective unconscious for ideas of inequality and difference that can be monetized politically.
It's fascinating and genuinely disturbing.
What were some of these heresies? The descriptions I've seen were shockingly aggressive.
They were militantly inegalitarian lines of thought, presented as serious speculative opportunities. They included a comprehensive defense of eugenics. Arguments against the concept of sexual consent, suggesting it ran counter to fundamental biological and psychological drives. A detailed case for the U.S. to invade Greenland solely for its mineral extraction potential. The claim that global warming is actually benefiting the majority of humans by expanding habitable zones. An outline for the immediate mass deportation of Muslims from the U.S., and highly controversial arguments for ending academic research into indigenous history on the grounds that indigenous life was darker and more violent than popularly depicted and therefore not worth celebrating.
Wait, hold on a second. A defense of eugenics and arguments against sexual consent, openly celebrated by venture capitalists. That's not just disruption. That sounds like deliberate moral transgression used as a market signal. It's weaponizing offense for profit.
It absolutely does. And here's the immediate, profound irony. Many of these transgressive proposals were taken up very soon after by the second Trump administration or became serious talking point issues among political elites. This demonstrates that the festival, which was meant to test taboos in a speculative vacuum, actually revealed the immediate and dangerous convergence of VC culture with its pursuit of difference as speculative value and mainstream political power.
It confirms that the VC mindset is fundamentally about cultural and political production, not just financial engineering.
Which naturally leads us to the culmination of this whole project, the techno-optimist coup. This is the moment the ideology actively attempts to capture the managerial state apparatus.
And the manifesto, released by Mark Andreessen, serves as the battle plan for this coup. It presents a defensive, almost paranoid framing of the tech complex as suffering attacks from external enemies that are actively slowing down necessary progress.
It's the ideology of a powerful, entrenched elite positioning itself as the victim.
And who are these enemies of progress?
Everyone who suggests limits. It's a comprehensive list. It includes ecological activists, the state bureaucracy, ESG investing, tech ethics, risk management, and essentially any idea of moderation, caution, or sacrifice.
So the underlying philosophical argument is that technology represents the principle of excess.
Yes, the excess contained in the logic of the commodity. Therefore, any constraint on that excess is destructive to the future.
And the stakes are framed as existential, right? Like it goes beyond mere profit maximization.
It does. They moralize acceleration. Andreessen claims technology represents the ultimate principle of excess and that growth is necessary for society's survival. He says that societies, like sharks, grow or die. Furthermore, they escalate the moral argument by suggesting that any deceleration of AI will cost lives.
So they're framing technological stagnation as a form of murder.
It's the ultimate statement of techno-capitalist inevitability. Either you accelerate our power or you are complicit in death.
And the political capture follows this rhetoric. We saw the plan to create the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, proposed with leaders like Musk and Ramaswamy at the helm.
This was a clear move for political capture. The goal was sweeping changes. The dismantling of what they call anti-democratic structures in the federal bureaucracy, which really means regulations they don't like. The practical outcome was fascinating. Tech entrepreneurs managed to shield their most profitable, disruptive ventures from public scrutiny while simultaneously gaining immense influence over the state bureaucracy that was supposed to regulate them.
The techno-optimists aren't just selling apps. They're selling a total ideological overhaul of governance.
And this venture capitalist ideology doesn't just reshape governments. It fundamentally transforms the individual subject. If the state is a business and disruption is a moral imperative, then the self must be viewed through that same hyper-economic lens.
Absolutely. The core concept here is human capital, where the self is managed explicitly as an economic resource.
It's a reflexive formulation where the subject is for himself his own capital. This framework forces the individual to view their education, their health, their skills, even their emotional state, through the lens of maximizing value using scarce means.
Your identity becomes inseparable from your current and future market value.
This goes far beyond just having a career. It means our worth and our identity are tied up in our perpetual performance and measurable productivity. This defines the achievement subject.
The achievement subject. A figure whose identity is constructed primarily through, virtuosic self-discipline and competitive productivity.
Exactly. This concept relates directly back to critical theory, specifically Herbert Marcuse's idea of the performance principle in modern repressive society. Marcuse argued that in advanced capitalism, the pursuit of pleasure isn't suppressed entirely. Rather, it's channeled into sanctioned, reduced forms.
What he called repressive desublimation.
Yes. The expectations of performance in service of capitalist competition become so embedded that they form part of the individual's basic psyche. They define how one's mind and body are wired to perform. The quantified self movement takes this principle and formalizes it with technical precision, turning self-discipline into data.
Let's talk about the quantified self movement, or QS. This seems like the perfect encapsulation of the financialization of the body and the unconscious. Who are these QSers, and what exactly is the goal of this extreme self-tracking?
QSers are enthusiasts, heavily concentrated in Silicon Valley and related tech hubs. They use every available device, self-tracking technique, and often DIY algorithms to carry out single-subject experiments on their own bodies, emotions, and behaviors.
And the purpose is speculative self-management.
That's it. They are constantly attempting to optimize their health, their mood, or their productivity by discovering probabilistic frontiers in their habits. They view their personal habits as valuable data patterns for speculative personal management.
They prospect the stochastic mysteries of the self. They're seeking to monetize their unconscious movements.
This is far more intense than using a fitness watch to count your steps or monitor your sleep.
The scale and intimacy of the data they track are phenomenal. It really illustrates the move to monetize every single aspect of existence. Give us some of the concrete, memorable examples of what this looks like in practice.
The examples are unforgettable, and they're drawn from their frequent show and tells. One accuser meticulously tracked his geolocation over 4 full years. He mapped every single movement he made, color-coded by year, to visualize his life patterns as a traceable asset.
Wow.
Another one meticulously visualized his daily coffee consumption over 2 years and 3 months.
Trying to discover hidden patterns linking caffeine to performance or mood variability that could be optimized.
It sounds like a compulsive, exhausting effort to find actionable, tradable knowledge in one's own existence.
What is perhaps the most bizarre, tangible example of this self-management being translated into a physical metric?
That would have to be the houseplant. One accuser connected his to-do list accomplishment to an automated device that watered a houseplant, which he named Eddie. Not at all. The plant's vitality, its literal survival and ability to photosynthesize, was dependent upon the accuser's purposiveness and self-discipline. If he failed to check off his tasks, Eddie went thirsty.
So it's a direct, tangible translation of self-management into biological consequence.
So this accuser's self-worth is literally tied to the photosynthesis of a single houseplant.
That is perhaps the most Silicon Valley thing I have ever heard. It's the ultimate, tiny, contained performance review that you can't escape.
It is the total financialization of physiological data. It's treating the body as an idiosyncratic device that needs to be harmonized with mathematically efficient markets. This thinking even infiltrated the financial sector itself. Look at the advertising that surfaced around this idea. An ad for Oppenheimer investment funds proposed using biometric sensors on traders to cancel out the physiological compromises that lead to excessive risk-taking.
Things originating from adrenal glands, testosterone, sweat. Right. So the goal is to purge the market of the greed and fear animal spirits that Schumpeter's creative destruction relies on, to isolate the purely rational, fearless financial subject.
Precisely. The goal of the censors is to isolate the human capital faculty of predictive wisdom from all that biological noise. The body's gut instincts, hormones, and biological processes are suddenly consigned to the involuntary and the irrational. They're the financial detritus at the edge of agency. The new model for the high-performing human is the flash trading algorithm, the perfect synthesis of speed and deliberation, devoid of human sentiment.
So the VC ideology, through the quantified self movement, actively imagines that to harmonize the recalcitrant human guts with the utopia of mathematically efficient markets, a new wave of microengineering miracles is required, treating the body as a device to be optimized.
This effectively financializes the human unconscious itself.
If we zoom back out, the combination of this centralized digital control imposing its rules globally and the profound institutional distrust fostered by the managerial state, it creates the perfect context for our current post-truth world. When objective reality is constantly mediated and filtered by unaccountable systems, trust collapses entirely, and facts become subjective weapons.
We are seeing the community that believes in objectively accurate, verifiable information, the dwindling reality-based community, struggle to hold on to any shared frame of reference. Daily cultural experiences condition millions of people to accept deeply tribal mindsets.
Whether it's political leaders declaring pronouns that were never in doubt or neighbors calling every hot summer climate change, the underlying verifiable reality becomes secondary to the narrative being pushed by the favored tribe.
We are drowning in data, yet we thirst for meaning because the data cannot be trusted.
And this intellectual fragmentation isn't just happening in public discourse. It's deeply embedded within the very institutions tasked with producing knowledge, particularly in academia.
The survey data on this is striking, and it's relevant to understanding why institutional critique is so popular. It highlights a massive political and intellectual skew in top American universities. The general proportion of liberal to conservative faculty is at least 8-to-1.
8-to-1.
But in fields that most directly affect public policy and opinion like sociology, history, and leading law schools, the ratio often skyrockets.
How high?
As high as 70-to-1. This level of intellectual unanimity, what you might find in a pre-modern school of theology, means that genuine non-dogmatic scholars and truth-tellers are often fleeing elite universities and newsrooms.
Which further erodes the capacity of these institutions to engage in serious self-challenge or constructive disagreement.
This homogeneous environment is ripe for epistemic coup. Successful and coordinated efforts to place specific, legitimate information beyond public discussion and debate.
These aren't just moments of misinformation. They are organized attacks on the constitution of knowledge itself.
They require consensus between prominent public officials, academics, journalists, and the essential cooperation or acquiescence of powerful social media companies to effectively muzzle specific viewpoints or narratives.
And they hold together just long enough to prevent policy alternatives or political outcomes feared by the participants.
And we have a clear documented example of this in the sources. The narrative of climate refugees being framed as a designed crisis.
Yes. Various think tanks and institutional actors frame the narrative of the Great Displacement, portraits of climate migration. And they rely heavily on anecdotes and emotionally powerful stories rather than verifiable, generalizable data or established demographic statistics.
The emotional assertion is that climate change is already driving internal migration and displacing Americans like real refugees who have no other choice. But the reality is that Americans who lose homes to hurricanes or wildfires are typically using insurance settlements and substantial government aid to rebuild.
They rebuild in their previous communities or new places of their choosing. They are not migrating as actual refugees who are stateless and unprotected do.
So the narrative, framed as a critical moral imperative, achieves two things. It simultaneously diminishes the serious global challenge of real, vulnerable refugee flows, and it distracts from other crucial international security implications, like competition in the Arctic.
By focusing attention inward on an issue framed purely by moralizing anecdotes.
And this designed ignorance is effective because the participants in these coups suffer zero reputational consequences within their powerful tribes.
Because they are enforcing the tribe's moral imperative.
They simply ensure the political outcome they feared is prevented, and the cycles continue, deepening the distrust that millions of citizens feel about their nation's elites and the fairness of national discourse.
So the systemic impact of this digital hegemony and ideological control is the collapse of mediating institutions. The places where we used to find some semblance of settled truth. If there's no coherence or trustworthiness in the external political and knowledge system, people redirect their expectations entirely.
That's the psychological consequence. The lack of certainty isn't ignorance. It's a radical disillusionment with the very infrastructure of truth. People are forced to focus their attention entirely on the personal sphere, family, career, faith, because this becomes the only place where choices meaningful to an individual are reliably generated.
They redirect their fundamental expectations from the government, which they believe is hostile or negligent, to their direct, immediate lives.
And consequently, this public now demands hyper-personalized service.
Not just from a coffee shop that can deliver a latte without milk, but from government and every other service.
This shift from expecting broad democratic consensus and uniform laws to demanding personalized interaction and results is a systemic response to the profound failure of the centralized managerial state to deliver anything other than neglect and ideological imposition.
To synthesize our analysis then, the quiet power exerted by Silicon Valley is far more than just technological control.
It is the imposition of a cultural and economic logic that rationalizes an unprecedentedly exclusionary form of value production. The venture capital complex, with its foundational ideology of creative destruction and the speculative carnivalesque, it assumes the obsolescence of the majority.
Those who cannot be quantified, optimized, or included in its long-tailed distribution of profits.
Yet it frames its own aggressive, unbounded growth as the necessary path to future abundance for all. It creates, in effect, an economy of neglect, where value is derived from the calculated deferral of remediation, ensuring that only the hypervigilant, self-disciplined achievement subject has a path to legitimacy.
The true measure of digital hegemony, therefore, is not the visible censorship, but the subtle, relentless shaping of what is considered reality and what is culturally and politically possible. It's the rigid logic baked into the rules of existence. From the code that censors a Renaissance masterpiece in Italy to the ideological framework that transforms personal health into speculative human capital, tying your self-worth to the vitality of a houseplant. The influence is systemic, quiet, and operates by the logic of permanent, self-accelerating revolution that never intends to resolve its own inherent contradictions.
And this systemic project of digital hegemony represents the triumph of what philosopher Nick Land termed the techno-capital machine, an engine of perpetual material creation and growth. It is a relentless and revolutionary drive, structured by the primacy of aggressive, asymmetrical speculation, leading to a relentless process that offers the promise of radical futurity through a distinctly revanchist status quo.